planning and storms that are, related to the climate reality we have now. This is something that happened it came very perilously close to happening in 2018 in Cape Town, South Africa, and it can happen here. And the only thing that saved them were very aggressive conservation and efficiency efforts. But there's many cities here in this country that face water stresses. Around the world, there are cities such as Tokyo and Sao Paulo and Melbourne, Australia, and Mexico City that have the same problem. And in our country, we have 5 cities. El Paso, Texas is one. The state population there is expected to double by 2050 to more than 50 million people. And they are continually plagued with drought. And the state is growing so fast that they have to continue to build new and resilient water supplies. They only get about 9 inches of rain annually. That may actually increase with the increase in rain events that global warming gives us. But that water doesn't tend to run through to the farmers who need to irrigate the crops. So the city is building a huge desalination plant that will convert brackish water into drinking water. And also to treat sewage water and turn it directly into drinking water. Phoenix, this is another town that is on the brink of severe water problems. The Salt River there provides about 60% of the city's needs water-wise. And because of the climate change impacts of that and the Gila River that it is a tributary of, they could be affected by a mega drought. They're sort of in the bullseye of our climate reality, if you will. Now they're working on some alternative sources. Stored underground water is one of them. But the infrastructure they need costs about $500 million. And it's still years away. So hopefully nothing too terrible will occur in that area before then. Then there's Los Angeles, which we know for a long time has been plagued with drought. Their groundwater represents less than 1/10 of the city's water supply. And even when it's getting plenty of rain, much of that water is lost because they have a very poorly maintained infrastructure. And it also evaporates. The Los Angeles River, which is covered with concrete to stop flooding in the 1930s, sends about 80% of rainfall into the Santa Monica Bay. So they're going to try to cut their reliance on imported water by half by diversifying sources. Then there's Miami. Increased flooding because of climate reality may wash toxic chemicals from Environmental Protection Agency hazardous Superfund sites in Miami-Dade County into the aquifer where the drinking water is. And Miami-Dade has 90,000 septic tanks, and intense flooding can raise the groundwater level and put it at risk of being contaminated by the tanks. Then there's Atlanta. Only 1% of Atlanta's total water supply is groundwater. More than 70% of the city's water supply comes from Chattanooga River Basin. And the city's population growth has put a tremendous strain on our water supply. And droughts put even more stress on the supply, of course. Water conservation is critical for the people of Atlanta. And the amount of water available to Atlanta can be affected. Apparently there's some lawsuits going on about how much water Georgia can take from the basins that also feed Florida and Alabama. Georgia has no, Atlanta has never had a lot of options about water supply because it has no access to a major river or lake. So those are some important cities that are being affected by climate change. There I said that word again. It's going to be hard to get that out of my vocabulary, but climate reality. And the next story that came out this week was about an Australian study on climate change, which was written by a former fossil fuel executive and backed by former chief of Australia's military, which basically describes climate change, okay, I'm going to use that phrase now because it's written in the article, as a near to midterm existential threat to human civilization that could lead to our extinction by 2050. It argues that extremely serious outcomes of climate-related security threats are far more probable than most people assume, but they're also almost impossible to quantify because basically we haven't had any experience with them in the last 1,000 years. Planetary and human systems, they say, are reaching a point of no return by mid-century, in which we face the prospect of a largely uninhabitable Earth. And this will lead, of course, to breakdowns of our, political order in nations and internationally as well. And they are, by the way, this study is much less optimistic than the UN's climate change report, which was not optimistic at all, and many called alarmist. Well, this is even more alarming. The only way to avoid this scenario, according to this report, is an emergency mobilization, they say, akin in scale to World War II, but focused on rapidly building out a zero-emissions industrial system to set in train the restoration of a safe climate. While here in this country, we hear debates that the green movement is it's too severe. It'll never work. Well, here you go. Scenario warns that our current trajectory will likely lock in at least 3 degrees of global heating, which in turn could trigger further amplifying feedbacks, unleashing further warming. And this will drive the accelerating collapse of the ecosystems, including coral reefs in the Amazon rainforest and in the Arctic. And the results of that would be devastating. Agriculture would collapse in the subtropics. Food production would suffer worldwide. Cohesion of nation states like China and the U.S. would unravel. And even if it was only 2 degrees of warming, more than 1 billion people would have to be relocated. And the scale of destruction is beyond people's capacity to even comprehend. And basically it says the likelihood is that human civilization would come to an end. I think we're gonna go more into this article next week because there's a lot here to talk about. But the thing to keep in mind, it seems to me, is that, and this is why I wanted to call this segment Climate Reality, is that it's very hard for people to imagine outside of a science fiction movie or book to get a sense of reality about this happening. It's fun in a movie, but it seems totally removed, and yet it's not. And it could be that the only way that starts to have a sense of reality to people is when they see it happening to their neighbors, their friends, or themselves. So, it's coming. I think we need to have another episode about this. So next week we'll focus on climate reality. But for now, after all of that, do try to keep your chin up. Have a positive view of vacation. You can take one. Use some techniques that I've talked about here or looked at to keep stress-free.